Hello everyone, I'm Ixalan, and right now we're in the midst of Rivals of Ixalan Limited Review Week. So far I've talked about all the white and blue cards in the set, and today we're looking at black. And there are still several more videos to come. I use a letter grade system to evaluate the cards in these videos. If you're curious about how I grade these cards, there is a link in the description below to a video on how I grade them. But for now, let's get started with the first black card. So the first card we're looking at is Arterial Flow, which for 1 generic and 2 black is an uncommon sorcery that says each opponent discards 2 cards. If you control a vampire, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. So this is Mind Rot with a tiny bit of vampire upside. It synergizes well with vampire decks too, because gaining life is important, as there are several vampires who like it when you gain life, and there are others that let you use life as a resource to make them better. Still, this is just Mind Rot, and Mind Rot is not usually the greatest card to mainboard in Limited. This is because once you and your opponent are in top deck mode, or your opponent's just holding on to 2 lands, it just isn't very good. Where it is good is against opponents who always seem to be holding on to cards, a good sign that they have some powerful or situational spells that, if you make them discard, you're going to feel pretty good about. So, like Mind Rot usually is, I think this is a D as a mainboard card and a C out of your sideboard. It is worth noting that this is sort of like Blightning, and that unlike Mind Rot, it actually does something in a worst case scenario if your opponent's hand is just empty, provided you control a vampire. But draining your opponent for 2 for 3 mana is just not very good. What made Blightning better is the fact that you didn't have to jump through a hoop to do the damage. Here you have to have a vampire in play, which isn't the most difficult thing to do, but still it's asking you to do a little something extra. Next up we have Canal Monitor, which for 4 generic and 1 black is a 5/3 lizard at common. This is black's mediocre vanilla card. Actually, mediocre is probably a little too strong. This thing's just bad. If you're spending your turn on 5 casting this, you're probably about to lose. It has bad stats, no relevant creature type, and is overly costed. It's just an F. Next we have Champion of Dusk, which for 3 generic and 2 black is a 4/4 Vampire Knight at rare, and it says when it enters the battlefield you draw X cards and you lose X life, where X is the number of vampires you control. Wow. So even on its own, this is an excellent card because it is a 5 mana 4/4 that draws you a single card. That's basically always going to be a 2-for-1, right? But this gets even better in a vampire heavy deck where you can be drawing a ludicrous number of cards. Now, of course, this can occasionally get you into trouble, especially since this isn't a May effect, so keep that in mind. But the Vampire Tribe is also loaded with ways to gain life, so this actually synergizes pretty well with that. You should have some spare life for the potential to gain some life, so paying 5 and drawing 5 cards is going to be worth it and be utterly backbreaking for your opponent. This thing is an absolute bomb in a vampire heavy deck, and as I said, quite good in the even if it's the only vampire in your deck, which I like. I wish they designed more cards like this, and I've said in the other videos, more cards that are good on their own and don't only get to be good if you have 12 vampires in your deck. But anyway, this isn't one of those cards. It's a B on its own, and it's a straight up A in a vampire deck. It's just going to win a lot of games because of the massive amount of card advantage it gives you. Next we have Dark Inquiry, which for 2 generic and a black is a common sorcery, and it says target opponent reveals his or her hand. You choose a non-land card from it. That player discards that card. This kind of card effect does not play especially well in Limited. Not building your board on turn 3 and casting this instead is a good way to lose the game. Sure, you get a 1-for-1 and you get some information, but that's actually the ideal situation, and it still isn't great because you're spending your early turn doing this instead of playing a creature. In the late game, it can become completely useless. It isn't the worst sideboard card against opponents looking to ramp into creatures or cast big spells, but even there, I would rather have some of the other discard effects in this format. It is an F in the main board, and I guess like a D+ out of your sideboard. You're almost never going to side it in, though. Next, we have Dead Man's Chest, which for 1 generic and 1 black is a rare enchantment aura with enchant creature an opponent controls. And it says, when enchanted creature dies, exile cards equal to its power from the top of its owner's library. You may cost non-land cards from among them for as long as they remain exiled, and you may spend mana as though it were mana of any type to cast those spells. Here is my candidate for the card that people are going to most frequently overrate in this format, because what it does is inherently powerful. What that text box says is insane. You can basically steal a bunch of your opponent's cards. It's also really cool flavor-wise. It's got cool art. It has a lot going on. But it is terrible and limited, I hate to tell you. First, you have to have a way of killing your opponent's creature. Second, that creature has to be fairly large for this to be worth it, at least a 3/3 or so, and you can still whiff in that situation. So you're already using 2 spells, 2 cards anyway, to kill a creature basically, one being Dead Man's Chest and one being a kill spell. Because of that, you have to net at least 2 cards with Dead Man's Chest, and there's no guarantee you can do that. There are going to be instances where this just does insane things, and people will point to those few instances as evidence that this card is good. I'm sure I'll get screenshots tweeted to me of people who killed their opponents like 12-12 with it and how awesome it was. But those are going to be rare situations. Most of the time it's going to be completely useless. It'll rot in your hand or sit on one of your opponent's creatures doing nothing. It doesn't kill a creature on its own. It doesn't do anything on its own. It needs you to do something else. And because of that, it's just not good in limited. And I'm going to give it an F. Avoid it. Let other people play it and be disappointed, like 99% of the time. Next, we have Dinosaur Hunter, which for 1 generic and 1 black is a common human pirate and a 2/2 who says, whenever Dinosaur Hunter deals damage to a dinosaur, destroy that creature. A 2-mana 2/2 with a relevant creature type and some extra upside against dinosaurs, essentially gaining death touch against them, although it's actually a little better if you find a way to make this do damage to creatures outside of combat. It still just straight up kills them, which to dinosaurs it is, and that's pretty cool. I think it is, a main boardable card, but it's not anything special. If you need a 2-drop pirate, you could do worse. If you end up with plenty of other 2-mana 2/2s that are better than this one, pushing it into your sideboard isn't a bad idea, since not everyone's going to be playing dinosaurs, but I think it's a C. I mean, it's a solid pirate that you'll play. Next, we have Direfleet Poisoner, which for 1 generic and 1 black is a 2/2 human pirate at rare with flash and death touch, which is a nice combination. And it says, when Direfleet Poisoner enters the battlefield, target attacking pirate you control gets +1/+1 and gains death touch until end of turn. There are a lot of crazy low-curve rare creatures in this set that are very powerful, which shows us that at least to some extent, the aggressiveness of Ixalan is going to live on in this set, though I think ramp is a little more real in this set, and there's better removal. I do think aggressive decks are still going to be quite strong, and Direfleet Poisoner is one of these low-curve rares that's just insane. Even in a deck with 0 other pirates, it's pretty solid, as you can flash it in to kill any creature thanks to its death touch. It's almost like it's a Terror or Doomblade effect, although obviously not quite as good because your opponent has to attack into it, and etc. But obviously, that being the fail case of this card is really good. And it's just a 2/2 with death touch when that's what you need as an attacker. Obviously, people aren't huge fans of having to block those. That alone is enough to get this pretty close to, a B. In fact, I'm just going to give it a solid B. Maybe B- is a little better for what it is without any other pirates. But the extra upside, the fact that it can be used as a combat trick that gives both death touch and +1/+1 is crazy. This card's going to help you blow out a lot of opponents out of nowhere. Sure, you need a bunch of pirates to be able to consistently use her as a combat trick, but that shouldn't be too hard. I think she's an A in a deck that has, 10 pirates in it just because that ability is so strong, while she also just adds herself to the board, and she's obviously a problematic creature herself. So this is the kind of card you can first pick, and it'll be good in any black deck, but excellent in a pirate deck. Next, we have Dusk Charger, which for 3 generic and 1 black is a common horse with Ascend. Ascend being that mechanic where if you have a card with Ascend and you have 10 or more permanents at any given time, you get the City's Blessing, and you hold on to it forever, regardless of how many permanents you have after that. And the creatures and spells that have Ascend all do something extra if you manage to get the City's Blessing. In Dusk Charger's case, it's a 4-mana 3/3. Well, if you have the City's Blessing, it's a 4-mana 5/5. So it's an interesting card. A 4-mana 3/3 is pretty bad on today's vanilla test, but a 4-mana 5/5 is awesome. I think playing this as a mediocre 4-drop on turn 4 is okay, since in the later parts of the game it can get much larger. That said, it isn't a card you're going to be rushing to put into your decks or anything, unless Ascend decks end up being really prolific and able to Ascend on like turn 5 on a regular basis, but I don't see that happening a ton. I think it's just a C. You'll play it, but it's not anything special. Next, we have Dusk Legion Zealot, which for 1 generic and 1 black is a 1/1 vampire soldier at common that says, when Dusk Legion Zealot enters the battlefield, you draw a card and you lose 1 life. This is my kind of common. I always love Elvish Visionary when it's printed, And sure, this isn't exactly Elvish Visionary because it makes you lose 1 life to draw the card, but it has a creature type that matters in this format. It's a high quality common, one you will play multiple copies of if possible in most black decks. It's important to note, by the way, that it's a good common in any black deck and not just in a vampire deck like so many cards in these sets are. I'm going to give it a C+. It's the kind of common that you can feel good about taking relatively early and that you feel good about having in your deck. Next, we have Fathom Fleet Border, which for 2 generic and a black is a 3/3 Orc Pirate at common that says, when it enters the battlefield, you lose 2 life unless you control another pirate. This is one of those tribal payoffs that really isn't a payoff. It just doesn't have the downside it normally has, which is a relatively sizable one, if you meet the tribal requirement. A 3 mana 3/3 is nice, and you'll play this in your pirate decks, but it's still just a C. Next, we have Forerunner of the Coalition, which for 2 generic into black is an uncommon human pirate, a 2/2 that says, when it enters a battlefield, you may search your library for a pirate, put it on top of your library, that's about it. Whenever another pirate enters the battlefield under your control, each opponent loses 1 life. This is a good pirate payoff. All the Forerunners are pretty good, letting you find your best pirate and putting it on top of your library, or the situationally best pirate anyway, and doing 1 to your opponent every time you play a pirate is pretty nice. 3 mana for a 2/2 with all that text is a pretty solid deal. Obviously, this is a build around, an F in a deck without enough pirates, but I think it is a B- in a pirate-heavy deck, and it's a kind of uncommon that in a really weak pack you can be like, you know, maybe I'm just going to take this and force pirates, and if pirates ends up being open, it's going to end up being a very good card in your deck. Next, we have Golden Demise, which for 1 generic and 2 black is an uncommon sorcery with Ascend, and it says, all creatures get -2/-2 until end of turn. If you have the City's Blessing, instead only creatures your opponents control get -2/-2 until end of turn. This is the kind of card that gives me hope for control decks in this new format. 3 mana for a -2/-2 effect to the whole board is pretty standard and usually an okay playable. If this format plays out like Triple Ixalan did, though, it's going to be incredibly good. If we had this card in the last set, it really would have stopped a lot of decks in their tracks, frequently getting close to a board wipe effect. It comes with the added bonus of Ascend, making it one-sided is obviously a lot better. This is a hard card to rate, as in most formats it would probably only be like C, since not everyone is playing aggro, and you have to sort of build around it. Your deck only wants this in certain situations. But in this format, I think that the format will continue to be fast enough that this being around is important, and control decks are really going to seek out this card. And because of that, I'm going to start it at C+, and would love to see it get even better. Next, we have Grasping Scoundrel, which is 1 black mana for a 1/1 human pirate at common. And it says, Grasping Scoundrel gets +1/+0 as long as it's attacking. I don't like low curve creatures that quickly become useless, and Grasping Scoundrel is the poster child for that. Sure, if your opponent gets a slow start, maybe it hits them hard early, but in most scenarios it'll attack maybe once and never attack again. It can at least trade with 2/2s when it attacks late, so I'm going to let it escape being an F, but I am going to put it at D. Next, we have Gruesome Fate, which for 2 generic and 1 black is a common sorcery that says each opponent loses 1 life for each creature you control. We've seen cards like this before, and they've always been terrible. I get it. The idea here is you could have a bunch of vampire tokens or something in play and really do damage to them. But guess what? If you have a bunch of those in play anyway, you're probably already winning. This is just a bad win more card. Never play it. I'm going to give it an F. Next is Impale, which for 2 generic and 2 black is a common sorcery that simply says, destroy target creature. 4 mana to kill anything is a solid deal. This is sorcery speed, which keeps it from being too good, but most black decks will play like 2 of these and feel pretty good about it. It's a first pickable common. It could end up being a little clunky if this format is as fast as the last one was, but I think it'll be enough slower that Impale will be solid, and I'm going to give it a B-. Next, we have Mastermind's Acquisition, which for 2 generic and 2 black is a rare sorcery that says, choose one, search your library for a card, put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. The other option is, choose a card you own from outside the game and put it into your hand. It's been interesting lately that Wizards has been printing more cards in the style of the old Wish cards that let you get cards out of your sideboard, which, by the way, keep in mind, if you're casting this at a draft at your local gaming store, the thing that's where it says card you own from outside the game literally just means your sideboard. I hate to break it to you. You can't go grab your Black Lotus or something like that. This is a strictly better Diabolic Tutor, since it also lets you look in your sideboard, but it is still basically just an expensive form of card advantage. 4 mana to go and get a card is pretty steep. It does get to be a little better if your deck has like 1 or 2 incredible bombs in it that it's like if I play this, I'm just going to win. But even then, I don't like this a ton. I'm only going to play it on very rare occasions when my deck is just the right kind of deck, like a black control deck with some huge bomb like Tetsamok at the top as a way of winning the game. And I'm going to give it a D-. Next, we have Mausoleum Harpy, which for 4 generic and a black is a 3/3 Harpy at uncommon. It has flying, it has ascend, and it says whenever another creature you control dies, if you have the city's blessing, put a +1/+1 counter on Mausoleum Harpy. I don't like this card a whole lot. I think sort of my rule of thumb when looking at these cards with ascend is if they're solid playables, even in the absence of obtaining the city's blessing, then they're okay cards. This is not one of those. It's an overcosted creature who only gets worth it once you have Ascend, and you know that's not very good. A 5-mana 3/3 flyer isn't a good rate, and honestly, even if you manage to get the city's blessing, the upside here isn't incredible. It doesn't like immediately get a stats boost or anything. You have to have your creatures start dying around it for it to do anything. I'm going to give it a C-, and I could see it even dropping into the D range. Next up, we have Moment of Craving, which for 1 generic and 1 black is a common instant that says target creature gets -2/-2 until end of turn, and you gain 2 life. This is a very efficient removal spell, something that was really missing in Triple Ixalan, and something that will hopefully contribute to longer games. 2 mana to kill a small creature at instant speed is already great. Adding some life gain gives it some synergy with vampire decks, and like other -X/-X effects, you don't necessarily have to outright kill a creature with it for it to be good. You can pair it with the block to take down a much larger creature while keeping your creature alive. All of that amounts to this being perhaps the best black common in the set, and it is one of the few commons in the set that I think just obtains a straight B. Next, we have Oathsworn Vampire, which for 1 generic and a black is an uncommon vampire knight. It enters the battlefield tapped, but you can also cast it from your graveyard if you've gained life this turn. A 2-mana 2/2 that comes into play tapped isn't great. I mean, a 2-mana 2/2 that does nothing else is already sort of like a D, D+, and this comes with additional downside. So it's probably like a D- in a deck that doesn't have a bunch of ways of gaining life. But it can pull a Gravecrawler and just start coming out of the graveyard if you're gaining life consistently, and that's just awesome. Your deck has to have a lot of life gain to make this better than a D-, but let's say you have, I don't know, 6 or 7 ways to gain life. I think it moves all the way up to a B because it just won't stay in your graveyard. It'll keep coming back, it'll keep being able to attack, it'll keep blocking, and it happens to be a vampire, which itself is obviously upside. Next, we have Pitiless Plunderer, which for 3 generic and 1 black is a 1/4 human pirate at uncommon, and whenever another creature you control dies, create a colorless treasure artifact token. This guy isn't giving you the best stats for 4 mana, but they could be worse. Turning every one of your creatures who die into treasure is nice. It helps you maintain permanence to try to get enough to ascend, and it helps you ramp and fix. Still, in a format with tons of powerful 2 and 3 drops, a creature this defensive does seem a little bit out of place. On the flip side, it can certainly block a lot of those 2 and 3 drops effectively. It is still a pirate, and one with some nice synergy in the set, but it isn't anything incredible. You're not going to be like, man, I really need a Pitiless Plunderer to round out my pirate deck. I'm going to give it a C+. Next, we have Ravenous Chupacabra, which for 2 generic and 2 black is an uncommon beast horror and a 2/2 that says when Ravenous Chupacabra enters a battlefield, destroy target creature an opponent controls, period. Well, this card's amazing. 4 mana, kill anything. Sorceries are already pretty good. We saw one already. It was a B-, right? But this one comes with a 2/2 body, setting you up to get a 2-for-1 without a lot of difficulty. In other words, you kill their best creature, and then you block an X2 with this, and you're coming out ahead. This is one of the best uncommons in the set, maybe the best uncommon in the set, and it gets even better if you're packing some blink effects like Siren's Ruse, which would just be hilarious, or ways to bring this back from your graveyard. This is the kind of uncommon that actually gets into the A range, and maybe the charging Monstrosaur of this set, and I'm going to give it an A-. You're going to first pick this over like 95% of the rares in the format even. You're not going to see this card a lot unless you open it, in other words. Next, we have Reaver Ambush, which for 2 generic and a black is an uncommon instant that says exile target creature with power 3 or less. Instant speed removal that exiles stuff seems pretty good to me. The fact that it can only hit smaller creatures, does make it a little more narrow, though that's still the vast majority of creatures in the format. I think it just barely makes it into the B range at B-. It's good removal, right on the fringe of being premium. Next, we have Recover, which for 2 generic and a black is a common sorcery that says return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand, draw a card. We've seen effects like this a lot. I think this may just actually be a straight up reprint itself. So this guarantees you a 2-for-1, assuming you have a creature in your graveyard, but it doesn't affect the board immediately, and that's a little scary. Where it really will shine is in decks with powerful bombs or creatures with strong enter the battlefield abilities like the Chupacabra. I think this is a D+, though, for the most part. You're going to occasionally end up in a deck where you're like, man, it's going to be hilarious to bring back my 3 Ravenous Chupacabras or, you know, my Tetsamok or something. But most of the time, you're not going to want to play it. Next, we have Sadistic Sky Marcher, which for 2 generic and a black is an uncommon vampire soldier and a 2/2. It has flying and lifelink, and it says as an additional cost to cast Sadistic Sky Marcher, reveal a vampire card from your hand or pay 1. So it's part of that cycle of tribal creatures who all want you to have a card in your hand and make them a little more efficient. This is the vampire part of that cycle, and I think this one is the best of all of them in a deck that isn't actually getting there on having enough of the right creature. This is because a 4-mana 2/2 with flying and lifelink is already solid, probably like a C, nothing special, but adding the vampire synergy pushes this thing all the way up to a B. So if you have like 10 vampires in your deck and consistently play this as a 3-mana 2/2, you're going to feel pretty good about it. I think this is worth spending an early pick on, as you'll play it in any black deck, even if you don't end up with enough vampires to consistently cast it for 3. Alright, next up we have Tetsamok, Primal Death. You've heard me reference him several times. He's 4 generic and 2 black for a 6/6 legendary creature, Elder Dinosaur, so he's part of that cycle. He's rare, he has Death Touch, and you can pay 1 black, reveal Tetsamok Primal Death from your hand, and put a prey counter on target creature. Activate this ability only during your turn, and when he enters the battlefield, you destroy each creature your opponents control with a prey counter on it. This card's great, and I think the best of the cycle, though the red one, which we'll talk about tomorrow, does come close. A 6-mana 6/6 with Death Touch seems pretty amazing, but honestly, adding Death Touch to a body that big isn't that big of a deal, since a 6-mana 6/6 is so big that most things will die with it in combat. Sure, the fact that it can take down a 7/7 makes it a little bit better, but the Death Touch isn't a huge deal, though. What is, though, is its ability to add prey counters to your opponent's creatures throughout the game. Sure, your opponent knows Tetsamok is going to come down and wreck their board, but there isn't a ton they can do about it in most situations. I think most of the time you'll drop this guy and kill 1 or 2 creatures, and that's plenty when it comes with a 6/6 body. Think about going back to the Chupacabra. It's only a 2/2 for 4, and it's going to kill 1 thing every time. Sure, you have to do a little more setup here, but killing 1 creature with this, even as a 6-mana 6/6 with Death Touch, is an excellent deal, and that's really not out of the realm of likely, even. I mean, it's going to be pretty likely you kill at least 1 thing, and sometimes you get to kill 2 or 3. It's an A. You should first pick this in almost any case there is. Next up, we have Tomb Robber, which for 2 generic and a black is a 1/1 human pirate at rare. It has Menace, and you can pay 1 and discard a card, and it explores. You know I love exploring, and a creature that can do it over and over again appeals to me greatly. Being able to cash in lands in the late game for Explore is in many ways just better than cycling, and coming with Menace means that this thing gets big enough. It's one heck of a problem. However, it starts out as super small for a pretty high mana cost. 3 mana for a 1/1 is horrendous and can potentially lose you tempo in the early game when your opponent spends a 1 mana removal spell on it. This is the kind of card that can help grind out a long game, but is something of a liability in early going. Once you untap with it, your opponent does have to respect the threat of activation here, where the robber could suddenly become massive. Keep in mind, when you're exploring over and over again, if the card you see is a non-land on top of your library, you can just keep putting it back as many times as you want. So you can just make this discard a card, give it a +1/+1 counter if you know the top card of your library is a non-land card. So you know, you don't, while you're exploring over and over again, if what you really need is for him to just get bigger, you just keep putting the non-land card on top of your library back on top, and he'll keep just getting bigger. Still, it starts out small, it takes some setup, and I don't think this card is bad. I just want to convey that it isn't like an amazing rare. I think it's just a solid playable in most decks, with the caveat that if you end up with a ton of cards that like when you explore, it gets better, and I'm going to give it a C. Next up, we have Twilight Prophet, which for 2 generic and 2 black is a 2/4 vampire cleric at mythic rare. It has flying, it has ascend, and it says, at the beginning of your upkeep, if you have the city's blessing, reveal the top card of your library and put it into your hand. Each opponent loses X life and you gain X life, where X is that card's converted mana cost. That effect is the kind of effect that I had to read and reread over and over again, because usually when black draws extra cards, it pays life. It doesn't hurt the opponent and gain you life. I mean, maybe it'll gain you life, but doing both of them together is kind of insane, and that's what this does. This is perhaps the strongest Ascend effect in the entire format. Beyond that, if we just forget about all that block of text, which again, Ascend isn't going to be obtained all the time, it has a pretty reasonable fail case scenario. As a 4-mana 2/4 flyer, it's about on rate, and it has a relevant creature type too, so you know, you're not really giving up a lot by taking this. It's not like it's a 4-mana 1/1 that doesn't have an evasive ability. It has some legit stats and flying. If you have this, you really do want to build for the City's Blessing, because this will absolutely destroy your opponents between the card advantage and the extra damage and life gain. In black, this means being really into vampire tokens and maybe even treasure. Because it only becomes a complete powerhouse in the late game, I don't think I can quite just label it a bomb and give it, you know, an A- or higher, which is what I tend to give bombs. But the fact that its fail case is a solid flying creature keeps it from slipping too far, and I'm going to give it a B. I think it's going to be first pickable in a lot of packs, you know, unless there's something better. But given that this is a mythic rare and it'll be taking up that slot, there aren't a lot of uncommons or commons that you're going to be taking over this. Next, we have Vampire Revenant, which is 3 generic and 1 black for a 3/1 Vampire Spirit at common, and it has flying. 4-mana 3/1 flyers are always like okay-ish playable cards, and this has the vampire creature type, so it's just like a C-. You'll play it if your vampire deck is low on vampires, but it dies to everything, so keep that in mind. But it does hit pretty hard in the air. Next, we have Vona's Hunger, which for 2 generic and a black is a rare instant with Ascend, and it says each opponent sacrifices a creature. If you have the City's Blessing, instead each opponent sacrifices half the creatures he or she controls, rounded up. 3-mana Edict effects aren't great and limited, especially in a format where so many people are going to have multiple creatures in play very quickly, but it's an okay card, probably like a C- if that's all this did, especially when it's instant speed, because you can cast it like in response to a creature being casted, and you know, you're sort of making a decision like getting to kill the creature you really want to kill when you do that. Adding the Ascend clause to this does make it better, as in the late game you cut your opponent's board in half. It still isn't something you want to take early, because there are going to be lots of situations where you just can't Ascend, and it is the mediocre card it usually is if you can't Ascend. But I think most of the time when you build a black deck, you'd feel fine about having one of these. I'm going to start it at C+. Next, we have Voracious Vampire, which for 2 generic and a black is a 2/2 Vampire Knight at common. It has Menace, and it says when it enters the battlefield, target vampire you control gets +1/+1 and gains Menace until end of turn. This is a great vampire payoff, especially at common. In a heavy vampire deck, it is going to make sure that you push through an attacker that probably wouldn't have been able to attack otherwise. Its own stats aren't incredible, but a 2/2 with Menace is at least sort of difficult to block, especially in a world where you can threaten combat tricks or removal spells in response to declared blockers. I think this is a D in a non-vampire deck. It's even playable there if you're desperate, and a C+, maybe even a B- in heavy vampire decks. That's the last of the black cards of Ixalan, Rivals of Ixalan, that is. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so others can enjoy it too. Also, don't forget to subscribe for more limited content. For example, tomorrow I'll be back with my limited review on all the red cards in Rivals of Ixalan. Thanks for watching.